How did I come to the ownership conversation? Many different directions, but really similar to what you outlined. When I was in university, I sort of had a number of experiences, sort of transformative experiences with cooperatives, in particular in the Berkeley Student Cooperatives at UC Berkeley. I lived in the largest housing cooperative in Northern America, which was insane, but it turns out that if you get 150 people and do a proper sort of commons management strategy, it works out. So I got really inspired by this idea that we could take economics into our own hands, that it wasn't just something that we had to receive, your whole life, even as a white male with like access to tons of education, access to mentors and all these other things. You're still brought up in this way that makes you a consumer of economics. It's like, okay, here's your place. You need to fulfill these roles. You need to get this type of work, and then you'll be a good capitalist consumer. So this idea that we could take economics into our own hands, we could design our own economic systems, we could have community-supported economics was absolutely transformational for me, and I kind of just got absorbed by it for many years. I worked with the group that David generously mentioned in one of his slides, Inspiral, which is a community kind of similar in intention to Uptime, I think. Community of social entrepreneurs supporting each other to basically do more and better work, helping sort of co-finance different projects as well as sharing equity in different projects. All kinds of fun experiments in that context. And so I worked on a number of these different community or commons-based cooperative projects, and then had this extended experience of traveling around the world for about a year and a half, from leaving New Zealand, where I was based while I was working with Inspiral, and traveling around the world, largely around Central America and Europe, and trying to understand what is the new economy, what are these things what are the projects that people are doing that are most impactful, that have the most potential, that are creating real change? Because I have this kind of impression that there's quite a lot of theorizing in the new economy space. So I was really excited to see who's really doing it. And along that way, I learned a whole lot. There's enough. I could spend my entire time just talking about what I learned on that trip, but to speed it up, one of the things that I got sort of involved in starting is the current project that I'm working on, which is called Purpose Ventures. Purpose Ventures, our mission is basically to help mission-oriented companies stay on mission for the long term. So this sounds really simple, but it turns out that within the current paradigm of our economic system, it's amazing that I can say this on stage. This is great. It turns out that within the current context, that's actually really, really difficult, and especially if you want to create a company that is impactful at scale, to find the financing, to find the structures, to keep you aligned with your mission in the long term is really non-trivial, and it's certainly not as simple as incorporating as a B Corp. There's cultural aspects, there's finance aspects. It's very, very complicated. So we kind of work on the entire stack of those issues with companies. So I guess like the very, very short summary is there's 3 different parts of what we do. We have a consultancy that supports companies to take on alternative ownership structures and financing, and also helps raise capital for these companies. We have a fund, which is our own capital to deploy for these companies, and try to use that fund to amplify the effect of that capital. And then we also have a think tank / legal network, which is sort of legal resources for these companies, as well as publishing research on the effects of ownership. In particular, we advocate a particular model that we coined steward ownership. Steward ownership is sort of historically very similar to cooperative ownership. Steward ownership is essentially 2 principles. First is steward-owned companies separate dividend rights, so the rights to the capital returns, from control. So just because you own a large financial stake of a company doesn't mean that you control the direction of the company. This Kind of sounds obvious when you say it like that, but this is a fundamental aspect of our economic system that drives a lot of decision making. So that's the first principle. And the second principle is that the purpose, or the profit, serves the purpose. So this can be in the form of donating the money, the extra money after you've paid salaries and dividends, et cetera. Or it can be for the purpose of reinvesting in the company, and the company's direct mission is going to address its sort of social purpose. That is kind of the model that we're supporting companies to take on, and that is very congruent with the cooperative economy, very congruent with this idea of the commons. And there's a lot of details, but I'll skim over it. Some examples of these companies are that you might know. Bosch is a tool-making company in Europe. They're actually one of the older Stewart-owned companies. They've been around for over 100 years. They invested in green technology way before anybody else in the sector. They have really high employee retention rates. There's been some management issues, but they're independent, and so they're able to actually solve those issues in a social way rather than from pressure from investors. Why is this so important? There's a lot of reasons, and I think all of us will talk about that, but fundamentally, we think that these models are better for the company in the long term, and they're also better for society. So it's kind of a win-win once you look at it. We want companies that stay aligned with their mission in the long term. One of the challenges of the cooperative sector in the past has been demutualization, and I think we're trying to we want to solve that problem and kind of be done with it, because we can talk more about demutualization. It's a complicated issue. And fundamentally, we want an economy that embodies responsibility. This idea of shareholders in Hong Kong deciding what happens, the decisions that get made in an oil company in the US that controls land in Canada is insanity. We have to relocalize the responsibility within the company so that the people who are running these companies know that it's their decision. It's not some outside stakeholder forcing them to destroy the planet. They're making that choice. And our kind of social hypothesis is that people will make the right decision if you allow them the right motivational structure. I'm going to stop there because there's a lot more, but that's me. Thank you.
My name is Lena Buffington, and I am a co-founder of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And the Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is this new model, right? It's really interested in marrying some of the tools out there presently, right? There are actually lots of very interesting kinds of tools and models out there around thinking about how to make real estate and land acquisition accessible, affordable. How do we do it in ways that are cooperative and that keep kind of community ownership, et cetera, et cetera. But there are gaps often in those models, right, that make them less accessible, less understandable. And so the intention behind this model, which was developed by the Sustainable Economies Law Center, was really to kind of look at these models. They pulled lots of different pieces together. It's a bunch of lawyers, so they know all the stuff, and they did it, and they made it all legal. So it's always I always know what I'm doing is legal, at the very least. I might not understand all of it, but at least it's legal. And so how I came to it, I'm gonna go there and then kind of go forward in terms of talking about the model more. Because really, I was thinking about this thing of land and ownership and home. And it's fraught. And it's very fraught for me personally, for lots of different reasons that are legacy, historical, yada, yada, but also very present. My first home ownership experience, my mom was a single parent, born Detroit, poor, yada, yada. She didn't buy our first home until I was in high school, and then lost that home to foreclosure. Not too long after that, because she got really sick. She got pregnant with my twin sisters, was really sick, couldn't work, lost her first home to foreclosure. My next home experience was years later. My husband and I bought a home in Philadelphia. We did all the stuff. We read Susie Orman. We watched the stuff. We did. We were okay, we're gonna do it. we looked at like 150 houses, literally. I kid you not. Like over years. I mean, like really, we did the stuff. We did the research. We did it all. We did not get a loan we couldn't afford. We did all the stuff, right? And then we bought the home like right before the market crashed. I kid you not. Like we closed on the house. We're like, yeah. And then the market crashed. And we were 100 grand underwater. Like that, right? And then it was suddenly a nightmare, like a real nightmare. I mean, luckily we were able to short sale in that little window. I mean, it was a nightmare, and the banks put us through hell. I mean, it was a nightmare. We're still paying for a portion of that house today, right? Because they wouldn't fully let us out on the short sale. And so it's fraught, right? So I was very, like, this whole notion of, like, ownership and home. I was just like, you know what? I want none of it. Done. Like, I was over it. Then I moved out here, and the rent is ridiculous. And I was like, oh, what am I going to do? So I was really just trying to figure out, like, this thing, this thing home and having a place and space and what does that mean and understanding all that stuff. And I started participating in this organization called the People of Color Sustainable Housing Network. Like, oh, I guess people know about it. Okay. Some years ago, like, and we would all meet, like, we were talking about stuff and dreams, and it was exciting, and people had all these visions. And then it was like, okay, how are we gonna do it? And then after a while, just because I am patience challenged, I was like, you know what? It's only so many times I'm gonna talk about this stuff if we can't do it, right? So we connected with the SELC folks, Sustainable Economies Law Center folks, and they were working on this model. And so some of us kind of started talking to them and learning, and we spent a year like learning and talking about it and trying to figure it out, and and made the decision to implement. Right, so we were incorporated as a cooperative corporation in February. I was actually out of the country because after November happened, I was about to leave the country. So I was out of the country trying to figure out where I was going to go. And then East Bay Prec was incorporated, and I came back, and I was like, okay, maybe I could do this. And so I was like, okay, whatever. Until I can get a job, I'll figure this out. I'll figure out what I'm doing. And so I started doing this work of trying to figure out what it meant to implement this thing, right? Like this model, this incredible tool that really has this tremendous amount of possibilities, right, in terms of the way that it's structured and the intentionality behind it. And somehow, this is apparently what I'm doing with my life now. So this is apparently what I'm doing. So this is what I'm doing with my life now. East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And, and what drove me to this work, I had no background in cooperatives, housing, real estate, economics, finance, none of it. I have a PhD in philosophy, right? None of this stuff. It's none of it, right? And so that's not why I'm doing it. What really kind of drove me to this and kept me in this work was I had this realization after all these years of working. I was in nonprofits, philanthropy, higher education. And I really started to get, and I was always very frustrated. And I felt like I was bumping my head up against this barrier and really trying to get at this social justice thing, right? Really trying to get at it. And I finally started to get that I had to deal with economics. I was not really trying to deal with economics. I was like, yeah, no, I'm not really trying to do that. But then I was like, you know what? If I'm gonna be serious, I gotta deal with this economic stuff. And doing this work with East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative has been this tremendous learning, right, of really beginning to understand how fundamental, right, and how just core and key to so much of everything we do is this relationship to land, what we do with it, how we have access to it, when we have access to it, what our relationship is with it, et cetera, right? And just the incredibly important role that ownership plays, especially when you talk about healing the wounds of systemic oppression and disenfranchisement. Ownership is key. It's key. It has to happen. Like, there has to be pathways, and there have to be ways for people to have a stake in where they are, what they do, how they spend their time, where we're, you know, all that kind of stuff. It has to be the case. And so this model for me was a real and concrete way to contribute and to participate in creating a tool, right? Because that's what it is, a tool. It's a tool that hopefully is a part of this whole ecosystem of all these very interesting ways that we're thinking about, you know, offering alternatives to what's happening so that we can do what Angela said and take the steps, right? And like do better and better and see more and further as we imagine what this new world might possibly look like. And so this particular model marries elements of community land trusts, elements of limited equity cooperatives, elements of cooperative real estate investment corporations, elements of even kind of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing as a way to create a kind of umbrella cooperative structure, right, that is owned as cooperative, right? So the corporation itself, the intention is for it to be owned cooperatively. And then the real estate that is acquired through the cooperative, the people who occupy those spaces will own it, right, and gain equity in it, right? Staff who work for the cooperative will own as staff, right? So we're really trying to build this multi-layered structure in which ownership exists in multiple ways at multiple levels, providing different pathways of ownership and entry points, right? So it's complicated. I'm not going to get into it. Very complicated. However, you know, a part of the complexity is the beauty because it makes it flexible. Because one of the major things that is often lacking in the present model is flexibility, right? And the importance to really kind of be in community and communication to figure out what's going to work. So we really wanted to build a model that would allow us to figure out what was going to work for a particular project within community, right? And this particular structure, we think, really it has written into its genes a lot of these capabilities. And so we're at the startup stage, which is a mess. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. And it's, you know, and it's this thing, right? Like, because when you're talking about cooperatives and then startup, depending on the audience, people, you know, it's like an oxymoron. And they're like, who's going to invest in that? Cooperatives. You know, no, really. Like people, I have these interesting conversations with people all the time. They're like, you all probably just need to get donations. So nobody's going to invest in that, which I disagree with. And we have these whole other conversations because that's bunk, right? But yeah, so that's what it is in a nutshell. Yes. Thank you.
So these are very diverse models, and I feel like there's probably no question that would be appropriate for all three of you, so I'm going to give you customized questions. So Ronnie, I would love to hear a little more about your ownership model and how it compares to kind of a lot of those accelerators we see out there, and why you think it's important. You know, what are the two different models and why you think ownership plays such an important role in your model?
Well, Lena talked a little bit about this. Owning homes and owning a business are two pathways to wealth creation. And we're focusing on the owning a business side of it. Now, owning your own business is a pathway to wealth creation. But what if you owned your own business and you had ownership into a fund of other people's businesses in your communities? And that's essentially what we're doing. We are turning this accelerator model on its head because a lot of the accelerators that are out there, they have their capital from venture capitalists, from high net worth individuals, and they've created this fund. And this fund is highly selective. You have to go through multiple rounds to get into the accelerator, and then once you get in, they do give you an equity investment, but they take, 5 to 10% of the company that you're creating, and it's going into this fund that only those venture capitalists and high net worth individuals own. And we're looking at that differently. We're providing a model where we're deeply and intimately with you on your business. And we're meeting with you every week, week in and week out. And, we're hearing all of that intimate trauma, drama in your business, and we're with you. And, in exchange for that, we're taking a membership fee. And part of that membership fee is the equity stake in your business. But instead of having that equity stake go into a pool that a bunch of high net worth individuals get access to, you actually own that pool. And the bulk of the profits that come out of that, cash distributions, if there does end up being a venture-backed business that does a capital, sells out and has a capital gains, which I doubt, just given the kind of people that we attract, then that goes back to everybody, past, present, and future, that has gone through the accelerator and has contributed their equity stake. Not only does it go to them, but it goes to the people who worked day in, week out with you on your business, and to a very lesser extent to the capital that seeded the program. And so this really flips this model and puts the ownership back in the hands of the people who are creating the businesses, rather than putting it in the hands of high net worth individuals that are seeding it, or having no ownership at all because the accelerator is grant funded.
I just wanted to make a comment that in this trip around the world that I mentioned a while ago, where I tried to figure out what the new economy was, I met so many people who are trying to do the thing that you're doing and who couldn't execute it. I guess I just want to take a moment to, can we have a hand or something? It's so insanely difficult to do.
So Derek, my understanding is that your organization, you actually have funding available for businesses that are willing to try this different style of ownership. So can you say a little bit more about what the requirements are to get that funding? What is that structure that you're asking your investees to have, and why you think it's important?
Yeah, totally. So the structure is the thing that I sort of briefly discussed, which is steward ownership. And steward ownership is really, it's quite flexible. It's not meant to exclude anything. It's not meant to exclude co-ops, but it's also not meant to exclude companies that sort of have 3 or 4 people who are really the entrepreneurs, and other people are just employees, and that's okay. So it's quite broad in terms of its application, and the requirements are kind of, I can sort of rephrase them in an easier way. So the first one is this sort of separation of control and finance. So the way that often manifests in more traditional companies is that at least 51% of the voting stock has to be non-tradable. So you cannot have control of the company is no longer on the market. It's in the commons of the company. So that's the first part. And I guess just to expand on that, sometimes companies don't start in that position. Sometimes in order to get started, you need to give away a certain percentage of the company, and we do support companies to do stock buybacks and stock restructures. So that's a big part of, that's probably one of the main parts of what we do, is negotiating between multiple sets of investors to kind of get everybody aligned and really realign the incentives with the mission of the business. And then the second requirement or principle of steward ownership is just that the profits serve the purpose, and I think most of the projects that are up here on the stage in the next 2 days will probably fit that bill, but again, that's quite a flexible principle, and for us it means that the stewards of a company need to decide what to do with the profit. It's not the investor's job to tell them what they should do with the profit. Maybe the right thing to do is reinvest 100% of it back into the company, and that makes perfect sense. For a real estate acquisition fund, maybe for 25 years it will be the best thing to do, to just continually reinvest profits. And our position as investors is to say, great, you need to do what you need to do to achieve your mission. Another way that manifests with companies that have quite a lot of profit is a foundation or some kind of structure that allows that capital to be reinvested in society along the lines of the mission of the company. And that is, the money that is given to those foundations is purely at the discretion of the stewards. So it's not being extracted, it's not, there's not a pressure relationship like the relationship between investors who want more dividends. It's the company steward saying, we can afford to give back to society, here's what we want to give back. And different companies come up with different ways of deciding how to allocate that. Some are, the workers decide, some are multi-stakeholder groups decide. We kind of take a little bit of a step back in terms of the how, and more just try to facilitate the process.
So what happens in terms of the investors getting a return? I assume you and the other investors get some kind of a return. So how is that determined?
Yeah, it's surprisingly straightforward, I guess. Like, maybe it should be more complicated, but we basically usually we use a number of different financial instruments. The ones that are probably most common for us to use are equity-like loans, which are they're loans with interest that scale to performance. So if a company does really, really well, we get a slightly better return. If a company doesn't do that well, we get a slightly lower return. Usually that's mixed with some debt to de-risk the investment. And sometimes we'll do redeemable preference shares, which is kind of a complicated mechanism that I won't go into the details of. So does that answer your question?
I'm just it sounds like you're saying the profits go to the purpose. So I'm just wondering, and to support other
Right,
stakeholders.
okay,
So I'm
see.
just wondering how you balance the need to pay some kind of a return to the investors and then the purpose and the other stakeholders.
Yeah, so investors are paid back. That's, for us, we take cap returns. So we basically work on a model that says we want to, we're not interested in extracting money out of companies. We're interested in companies growing and creating, 10 times the amount of value or 100 times the amount of value for the economy than they would for us as investors. So, so there's, a regular repayment capital stack with, oftentimes equity is first, and we repay that, and some amount of, or debt is first and some amount of equity. So it just depends. It's all, I don't know how deep into the actual mechanics of the capital stack we want to get on this panel, but it's quite normal. It's like it's almost like you're just taking out a loan from our fund. It just has slightly different dynamics that incentivize, that kind of put us on the same page and say, we really want you to do well. We would also like to do well if you do well, but we're not expecting us to do really, really, really well if you do really well. Yeah.
Got it. Cool. So Lena, I'm wondering, so I remember when I was in graduate school, I wrote a paper about limited equity housing. And the idea is that when you make housing more affordable for the people who live there, then it's fair to ask them not to necessarily take the huge bubble effect if the price of the housing goes up. So you limit the equity that people can get. And I remember there were people I got a really low grade on the paper because there was a concern, and there could be some validity to this, that when you ask people who live in a home to limit how much of a financial return they can make on that home that they're paying to live in, that maybe they won't appreciate it as much, or they'll feel like it's not fair that other people can buy a home and get like these big, people who buy homes in the Bay Area often get these really big returns. So how is the model addressing that? The fairness, and it's a similar question in a way to Derek, that, how do you deal with that fairness question where everyone is fairly participates in the market as it goes up and down?
Yeah, because I've been in this conversation before, and there's a couple different ways that I think about this, right? And a couple of different ways I talk about it. One, the reality is most people actually do not have access to purchasing of any kind of real estate that's going to give them any kind of return at any point in any conceivable future, because the buy-in costs are just way too high, right? They're way too high. And then as I learned, the reality is that the housing marketplace is just as flawed as every other marketplace, and there are no guarantees, right? They keep claiming that, that'll never happen. BS. It's going to happen again. I mean, you know, it's just, there's risk in the marketplace, and there's no guarantee that anybody's going to get some tremendous return because they buy a house or whatever else, right? So those things. And so what we're really looking at this as is, one, it's also inviting a whole different conversation around this thing of ownership, what that means, what the possibilities are, and really inviting people to think about ownership in a different kind of way that's not just about this kind of individualistic notion of wealth creation that's about how do I put in the least and get out the most, right? But really, how do I think about my community, right? And how do I think about the kind of community I want to create, the kind of world that I create, and invest in that, right? While also being able to do that in a way that does offer me some kind of return on investment, right? Because a lot of the problem is that, in fact, what we see, especially in a lot of communities of color, is people who are spending tremendous amounts of money on rents, right? With no options for ownership, which means that they're just kind of putting money into rents, putting money into rents, putting money ad infinitum. And so this opportunity, it also offers a pathway, right? Because, you know, that's another thing too, right? Like, I'm not, and, you know, different people fall in different whatever with this. Like, I'm not personally like, oh, nobody ever needs to own, they own, whatever. Like, that's not my thing, right? You know, because I get it, right? Especially for disenfranchised communities, I get it, that those things are important. So the way that I think about it, and the way that I often talk to folks who have those kinds of questions and concerns, is to say, I said to this one woman, we were having a conversation, I was like, imagine, right, you're paying your rent month after month after month after month, and then when you move out, your landlord gives it all back to you. She was like, what? Right? So you can kind of think of it in that way too. So I also see it as a potential vehicle, right, for folks who actually do not have the ready resources to do things like come up with $30,000 on a down payment for something, et cetera, because the cost of rents that they're paying are such a high percentage of their income that they can never put away or bank that kind of money. That this becomes an opportunity potentially for an individual to be able to live in a place and actually have equity stake in it, meaning that the money that they're putting into it, they're going to get out plus a little bit more, so that they could, if they chose, go out and buy their own house, right? They now walk out of that situation, they've got their down payment, and they've also had some place to live that they can contribute to and actually be in community, right? Because there's that whole other piece of it that's not just purely kind of financial, but it's also that piece of what it means to live cooperatively and live in community with others, right? And kind of take care of this space communally, you know? So I think that those pieces of it, right? So that's kind of, you know, how I like to think about it.
Nice. You know, I would love it. We do have like 12 minutes. I would love it if we could maybe get a couple questions from the audience. We have a bunch of mics up here.
Yeah, mics.
Oh, this one works. Just a little quiet.
Any questions?
No surprise. My question is related to, given that white supremacy and racism is woven into the DNA of American society, and the institutions that all of you are working in are nestled in those systems, how do we deal with the group psychology that was mentioned earlier and individual behavior to create the solutions that you're all engaged in?
I know you have some thoughts about that.
So yeah, it's not pretty. It's ugly, right? Lord, I'm going through some stuff in my own situation with this right now. It's not pretty, right? It's very difficult, right? Because of all those things that you mentioned. But you know, there's this one thing I've been thinking about. Like, I've had these two things on my mind kind of throughout this. One of them, Amaka put up earlier, Mondragon Cooperative. And the other one is Harriet Tubman, right? And just really thinking about this question of how do we, within all the stuff, do the thing? And we have examples of how we do that, right? We have examples of how people's, within the parameters, carved out spaces for themselves, right? And I think about that Underground Railroad, you know, and I think about Harriet Tubman going out into that wilderness, not just and again, right? People along the way, and the ways in which they did this, and they crafted and carved out this space for freedom to exist within a context in which freedom was not possible, right? It wasn't possible, right? But they didn't wait on possibility. Like, they didn't wait on something, you know, she wasn't like, she didn't wait on the United States. She was like, oh, no, I'm gonna be free today. And she made her freedom, right? And so that's how I feel about it. I feel like we just have to make our freedom. And it's ugly, and it can be painful, and it can be dangerous, and some people may get lost along the way. I'm sorry. But it's true. It's true. You know, it's true, right? And so I think we just have to be willing to do the work, and we have to be willing sometimes to not be so married to and limited to these lovely ideologies, you know, these beautiful fantasies about community and the people. Because, you know, the community and the people bring a whole lot of baggage, you know? And when you're working with people, when you do, there's a whole lot of stuff. And I think we just have to be real about it, and we have to embrace it, and we have to be open to being messy and cleaning it up and keep going and figure it out as we go, because there's no formula, there's no book out there that can be written to tell, you know, folks how to do it. It's just really, we have to be willing and to try to co-create together and learn together how to do this thing. Because chances are, it may not, it just may not necessarily be somewhere and go, okay, well, this is what it looks like. So we just have to, I think we're gonna have to be willing to take a certain amount of risk, right? And to be in experimentation, right? And to just embrace the reality of that it's gonna be messy, right? And it's gonna be a little painful. But at the end of the day, we can do something that's better. And it may not be perfect, right? But better is still pretty good.
Yeah, this is a really important question right now, and something that I deal with day in and day out. I really appreciate that you raised that question. You know, one of the things that I go back to is that I really have to give a shout out to some of the people who helped us get off the ground, like Conda, Ashara, Lisa, inviting us into this hub, a bunch of women, African American women, most of our first class. First cohort that took a flyer on me, you know, literally doing the presentations before, the day before class, putting them together and coming in and not teaching this stuff before. That most of that class were African American women and one Russian male, Fedor, who's here somewhere. And they were committed to being there. And so I got the love and support from these women who helped me stand up and say, this is who I am. This is how I can show up here on this stage with a kurta on in this age that we're in right now, where people who look like me, you know, they're not treated very well right now, right, either. And so, you know, that, I think, when I step out of that bubble, though, and sometimes when I'm up on this stage talking about what I do, and let's just be real, people are not necessarily used to seeing somebody who looks like me. And doing this kind of work, serving our community. And so that's very real to me. And so I have to balance this. I have to navigate this system of being in spaces where people don't look like me and are not used to seeing people who look like me do this work, alongside being in this wonderful bubble of all these women who are so supportive and building me up. And, you know, literally what they tell me is, don't get distracted, just keep doing what you're doing.
Awesome. So we have 2 more questions, and we only have 5 minutes. So let's move quickly.
Okay, well, this is something that you addressed already to some extent. And it's the idea of, do you make profit on housing? And my personal opinion has been for a long, long time that housing should not be a profit-making business at all, not even a little bit. Although, of course, you got to deal with, inflation, of course. But other than that, and I guess my thing is that, and I guess what I want to know is what your thoughts are on that. But just quickly, my thinking of how we deal with the larger problem is that we actually create a model that is very realistic, something that we do want to make almost as perfect as we can. And
Can we limit this just to a quick question?
I just want to say that inside of that would be easier to do inside of our own model.
And actually, I'm going to ask Gina to ask her question so we can maybe address both.
Okay, my question is geared to Rami and to Derek. In your accelerators and your choosing investees, how do you, what systems do you put in place so that you don't get caught up in picking what appears to be the ideal or the model of what usually gets invested in? How do you keep yourself accountable so that you can invest in things that may not fit the typical structures, I guess?
So why don't we have Lena quickly answer the question about profit and housing? If you could answer that quickly, it's a big one. And then those 2 can answer about choosing investees.
Okay, the quick short. We're having real microphone problems. Hello? I mean, okay. Hello? The quick and dirty is that realistically, at this moment, like we couldn't do it without some kind of profit. I mean, that's just kind of quick and dirty, right? I mean, the reality is we can't go from 1 to 100. Like, we just can't, right? So this model, that's not the intention of this particular model, right? So what we're really trying to think about is how to do what needs to happen, especially when you consider a real estate market that is incredibly inflated, to allow the greatest amount of accessibility possible, right? And so a part of that does require that there be a profit margin. And that's just kind of the reality of the situation we're in.
1 minute each.
We try to keep our program fairly open access. That being said, there are a few things that we look for. We want to see that someone is looking to make environmental, economic, or social impact with the business that they're trying to create. We also want to know that they're committed to the business that they're looking to create, and that they have an openness to having some hard conversations about social injustice in the world and how that affects the work that we're doing. And so those are the few things that we look for when we look into who we're going to take into the accelerator program.
Okay, is this working? Okay. Eliminating bias in investment decisions is really difficult. I think that my colleagues are from Germany. They've got a really different socio-political, cultural thing going on. And so, to be honest with you, my job is mostly to express how serious this stuff is on this side of the pond. And it's a process. I don't think that we're at the end of it by any means. I'm excited to have, and you said what keeps you accountable. I'm excited to have more people of color and more women on our board, more people of color and more women on our team, where we're going to hire somebody to run hopefully the next larger fund that we run, and we really want that person to be a woman and hopefully a woman of color. And it's really hard. I wish that I could stand up and say we did it and be the perfect example, but it's a work in progress. And yeah, that's about our time, right?
Yes.